When someone betrays you today, you might say they sold you down the river. But that phrase is not a metaphor. It is not a colorful exaggeration. It is a description of something that actually happened on an actual river to actual people. And the history behind it is more specific and more brutal than most people realize. To understand this phrase, you need to understand the geography of American slavery in the early 19th century. The country at that point had two very different economies operating side by side. In the Upper South, places like Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, tobacco farming had exhausted much of the soil. Plantations were shrinking. The demand for enslaved labor there was beginning to outpace what those estates could sustain. But further south, in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, the cotton and sugar industries were exploding. These were brutal, high-demand operations. The work was grueling, the mortality rates were staggering, and the planters needed bodies constantly. What connected these two worlds was the Mississippi River. It ran like a commercial highway, north to south, and it became the central artery of one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Between roughly 1790 and 1860, more than 1 million enslaved people were transported from the Upper South to the Deep South. Some overland, many by water. The river went one direction, south, and so did they. Origin story. The word sold itself is ancient. It comes from the Old English salde, the past tense of sellan, meaning to give, to hand over, to transfer for a price. That root traces back through Proto-Germanic across more than a millennium of use. By around 1200, the word sold appears in early Middle English records in essentially the form we recognize today. But the phrase sold down the river is not old in that sense. It is specifically and deliberately American, and it emerges from a particular system of commerce in human beings. Here's how it worked in practice. A slaveholder in Kentucky, say, or in Virginia might face debt, or a change in farming operations, or simply decide to liquidate what the law called property. The most common buyers were slave traders operating the domestic trade routes, and the most profitable destination was south. New Orleans was the largest slave market in North America. Ships and flatboats loaded with enslaved people traveled the Ohio River into the Mississippi, then south to Louisiana. The phrase, down the river, referred to this literal journey downstream. For an enslaved person in the Upper South, being sold down the river was among the most feared outcomes imaginable. It meant separation from family, from community, from any familiar landscape. It meant the cane fields of Louisiana or the cotton fields of Mississippi, where conditions were known to be even harsher, where the work was relentless, where the death rate from heat and disease was devastating. Frederick Douglass, writing in his 1845 narrative, described the terror this geography held. Douglass was enslaved in Maryland, and he wrote that the threat of being sold to a Georgia trader was used as a form of discipline and psychological control. The words, "I'll sell you south," carried the weight of a death sentence in all but name. Harriet Beecher Stowe made the phrase culturally visible to white Northern audiences in 1852 with Uncle Tom's Cabin. The central plot engine of that novel is literally a sail down the river. Tom, the central character, is sold by his Kentucky owner to a New Orleans buyer, separated from everyone he knows, and transported south along the Mississippi. Stowe was not inventing a dramatic device. She was reporting a documented reality that her readers in the North had been able to comfortably ignore. By the 1850s, sold down the river was appearing in newspapers and recorded speech as a recognized expression. It described betrayal because that is precisely what it was. An enslaved person trusted, to whatever degree survival required, in the relationship with an owner or an estate. To be sold, suddenly, violently, to a Deep South trader was the ultimate rupture of any implicit arrangement. It was the destruction of everything. The phrase migrated into broader figurative use after the Civil War. By the late 19th century, it was appearing in labor contexts, in political rhetoric, describing workers or constituencies who felt their representatives had handed them over to hostile interests. The mechanics of the metaphor were preserved even as the specific geography faded from public consciousness. The misconception. Here is the misconception worth addressing directly. Many people encounter this phrase and assume it is just a colorful idiom, something that evolved organically from the general concept of commerce and betrayal, the way dozens of English expressions have. Something like cut to the chase or bite the bullet, where the literal origin is obscure and largely irrelevant to current use. That framing is wrong, and the wrongness matters. Sold down the river does not have an obscure origin. It has a documented, specific geographic origin. The river is the Mississippi. The direction is south. The people being sold were enslaved African Americans. The buyers were Deep South plantation operators. The dates are roughly 1800 to 1860. This is not a case where the etymology is uncertain or debated among linguists. It is a phrase that entered the English language through a specific historical atrocity and carried that atrocity encoded in its structure for generations, even after most speakers forgot what the structure referred to. Modern echoes, the phrase did not disappear. It went through a long process of abstraction, becoming the standard idiom for any situation where someone in a position of trust betrays the people relying on them to a worse outcome. You hear it in labor negotiations when union members feel their leadership accepted a bad deal. You hear it in political commentary when a constituency feels abandoned by the party they supported. You hear it in sports, in business coverage, in everyday conversation. The Mississippi, the flatboats, the auction blocks in New Orleans, all of that has become invisible. What remains is the emotional architecture, trust, transfer, betrayal, and a destination that is definitively worse than where you started. Some scholars and writers have pushed back on casual use of the phrase in recent years, arguing that its specific historical weight deserves acknowledgement rather than unconscious deployment. That conversation is ongoing and legitimate. Deeper connections. The word sell itself has an interesting trajectory worth noting. The Old English sellan originally meant something closer to give, or hand over, than to exchange for money. The commercial meaning developed over time as economies formalized. By the Middle English period, the transaction implied had become explicitly financial. Sold out, meaning no tickets or merchandise remain, appears in records by 1899. Earlier, by 1867, sold out was used to mean bankrupt or deeply in debt. The word carried a consistent emotional charge. Something has been transferred, something is gone, the loss is final. What makes sold down the river unusual in the landscape of English idioms is that it preserves, in its bones, a very specific historical record. Most idioms drift far enough from their origins that the original meaning becomes trivia. This one functions differently. The geography is still there, the direction is still there. South means worse. The river is still the Mississippi. Even in abstract use, even when speakers have no conscious awareness of the history, the phrase still describes a one-way journey to a harder place, which is exactly what it described in 1835, or 1845, or 1855. That is worth sitting with. Language is a record. Every phrase we inherit carries the world that made it, whether we know it or not. Some of those worlds were violent. Some of those phrases are not metaphors dressed up as history. Some of them are history dressed up as metaphors. The domestic slave trade shaped the physical landscape of the American South, the demographic distribution of African American communities, and the economic development of the entire country. It also shaped the language. Sold Down the River is a small, daily reminder of that, hiding in plain speech. What is next? If this kind of history inside language is something you want more of, subscribe. Next time we are looking at